Welcome, everyone. I'm Rocco Rossi, President and CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and we have a really special session with all of you today. It's often been said that at the best of times, the single hardest job in politics is that of the leader of the opposition. You have the incredible responsibility of holding a government with far more resources than you have to account, while at the same time trying to balance both supporting when you need to support and holding to account when it's not working. And that's made even more difficult in a time of crisis when everyone is expecting all parties, all levels of government to rally around and to be one team to bring success for the entire country, while at the same time still managing that important message that no one party, no one group has the monopoly on truth. And so you need to continually hold people to account and to push for better and faster answers. And I'm delighted that we're joined today by the leader of the official opposition, the Honorable Erin O'Toole. It's so great on so many fronts. This is a man from a family who's been dedicated to public service. He's served us in the military before his political career. He spent significant time in the private sector as a lawyer and as a corporate counsel, and so brings that important experience to bear as well. Leader O'Toole, welcome to the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and please do us the honor of a few opening remarks before we turn to question period.
Well, this is a question period I will welcome, Rocco. So it's great to be with you as a friend and to be with your members today. So thank you to the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and all members for having me. It's good to be with you virtually here from Ottawa. C'est un honneur pour moi d'être ici avec vous comme chef de l'opposition et comme chef du Parti conservateur. Après 11 mois de la pandémie, on a des défis avant nous et on doit travailler ensemble pour protéger notre avenir. Canada is at a crossroads. The two paths before us could not be more different. One path veers off into the unknown with risky shutdowns and stark changes that will literally leave millions behind. That is the path of Mr. Trudeau's reimagined economy, one where an Ottawa knows best approach picks and chooses which jobs Canadians should have, in what sectors and in what parts of the country. It's a path where the connected few get richer, while working families often get left behind. The other path is steady and balanced. It may not be the most glamorous route or the most Twitter-friendly, but it will get us safely to our destination. It will deliver us to a Canada where the everyday Canadians who have struggled incredibly through this pandemic are able to get back to work. A Canada where manufacturing at home is bolstered, where wages go up, and where the dream so many families in Canada have of being able to afford a better life for their children can be realized. While the poet Robert Frost may have romanticized the road less traveled, he wasn't writing about a nation in the midst of the worst economic and health crisis of our lifetime. Hundreds of thousands have lost their jobs, and many entrepreneurs are worried their small businesses won't survive to the summer. Today, we learned from Statistics Canada that another 213,000 jobs were lost in January. As you know, Rocco, most of those jobs were in Ontario and in Quebec. That's 213,000 more families wondering how they will make ends meet and when they can get back to work, and if there will be a job for them to go back to. Now, vaccine delivery delays are further impacting business confidence across the country. Each day, the milestones for vaccines move further and further away. Even the Prime Minister's big announcement this week of domestic vaccine manufacturing, which we actually should have doubled down on at the start of this pandemic, his announcement won't supply any vaccines to Canadians until 2022. In the last year, we've seen a wild west of international procurement for PPE. Planes full of masks and ventilators were rerouted off the tarmac to the highest bidder. Then the race to secure vaccines, to get them into Canada, to get the syringes needed, to get those vaccines into arms, military deployments to help in long-term care homes. But despite all that, after a year of struggle, there is no end in sight for lockdowns because there is no real plan for vaccines. Without vaccines, there is no plan to reopen and rebuild this great country. Let's not mince words. Our country's future is at stake. And as leader of the opposition, I have a job to do to hold the Liberal government to account. But let me also be clear, above all things, as a Canadian, I want the government to succeed on vaccines. Canadians want the Liberal government to succeed. Only with millions of vaccines steadily deployed quickly will this country start turning the corner in this health crisis so that we can focus on the economic challenges ahead. And there are immense challenges, as your members know, Rocco. That is what the next election will be about. Who can secure a strong economic future for Canada following COVID-19? Which path do Canadians want to take? The path of a reimagined economy that leads nowhere and leaves millions behind? Or the solid and certain path to secure our future? That path may be steady, but after a year of this turmoil, I believe Canadians will actually welcome sure and steady over buzzwords and bafflegab from the Liberals. The Liberals were in charge of getting vaccines, and look what happened. Do you want the Trudeau government to be in charge of our economic recovery as well? It's time to stop the Ottawa knows best approach, an approach of Liberals helping Liberal insiders and a few elites get ahead. I believe we need to champion Ontario workers and businesses, their families, and the communities they're a part of. As you know, Rocco, this is very personal to me. I'm from a community that has a long history of manufacturing. My hometown of Bowmanville, Ontario, has been an auto town for 100 years. My dad worked at General Motors at the plant in Oshawa. Our neighbors and our friends were auto workers. Over the last couple of decades, I've seen parts of my hometown and the Durham region hollowed out. In many cases, jobs left and never came back. I know the challenges faced by our manufacturing sector. I know what it's like to see friends lose their jobs, often to outsourcing abroad. 30 years ago, the Western world made a bet. We would allow China to have preferential access to our market while they protected their own. Canada then looked the other way on human rights, intellectual property theft, and diplomatic aggression to enhance trade with a booming economy, hoping that over time, the communist regime would begin to liberalize and play by the rules. You know what? We were wrong. And now we and our allies must chart a new course. It may be more efficient and affordable to make drugs, masks, and ventilators in China, but it's not in our national interest to make things vital to our security and increasingly to our prosperity in countries like China. When the most efficient outcome does not align with our national interest, a conservative government will ensure that our national interest comes first. But we will also be there to help develop new markets and support the reshoring of strategic manufacturing to Canada. Great opportunities await in the realignment of global trade that is coming and has already started. But we must be clear-eyed trade realists. We must be forward-looking and establish new supply chains with developing countries like India, the world's largest democracy, that share that commitment, that share our partnership as a Commonwealth nation. Canada must also open its eyes to opportunities in developed economies. For years, I've been advocating for a CANZUK agreement. This trade and mobility deal would provide a stepping stone for further integration and partnerships with the United Kingdom, with Australia and New Zealand. Imagine the possibilities of exporting your products to these countries tariff-free and linking up into their supply chain. This isn't just a matter of economics. CANZUK is our best political option to build a bloc of aligned democratic countries, diversify our trade routes, and solidify our defense, intelligence, and commitment to human rights alliance. Canada needs to realize the next 2 decades will be defined globally by a clash between the United States and a rising China. We need to position ourselves accordingly. The Biden administration decided to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline on their first day without a second thought. They did so without even a phone call to Prime Minister Trudeau. Now the potential cancellation of Enbridge's Line 5 threatens to cause massive disruption to thousands of jobs right here in Ontario and to increase the price of everything from gasoline to groceries all across Ontario and Quebec. This is exactly what a reimagined Trudeau economy would look like. Lost jobs across sectors that he feels are old-fashioned or out of step. My job as the leader of the official opposition is to hold him to account, and I'm doing exactly that. Conservatives will be working relentlessly for an economic recovery that helps businesses, big and small, and their employees. One that isn't just tailored to jobs that the Liberals like. So from auto workers along the 401 corridor to small business owners in Northern Ontario, and I was speaking to some of them this morning, to truckers and entrepreneurs across the province, we will be standing up for working families and for the nobility of working hard for your family. But I have another very important job. As the father to 2 great children, one of whom is learning from home today, my greatest worry is failing to leave a better Canada for our kids. And that is actually what truly motivates me as the Conservative leader. I love this country, and I know there are going to be great days ahead if we're smart. That's why every day I'm telling Canadians about the vision Conservatives have for a stronger, more prosperous, and more united Canada. As we recover from COVID-19, it's time for certainty and competent leadership. It's time for ethical leadership in politics again. I want you to know that a Conservative government will always have your back. Canada is indeed at a crossroads. I know, and I think you know, and the members of the Chamber know, which path we must take to rebuild this great country, to get every Canadian back to work in every sector, in every region, to secure our future together. As I said, it may not be the glamorous path, but is one we can take together, where no one will be left behind. I hope you will join me to rebuild our economy and secure our future. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Chef O'Toole. Je suis très, très content que vous avez commencé en français. And it's such a pleasure. Look at the Q&A board is lighting up, and it's all over the media every day. The fact that Canada, a G7 country, is now at 26th in the world in terms of per capita vaccinations done, and yesterday 35th in the world in terms of absolute vaccinations delivered. But we can't relive the past. The question is, go forward. What are the key things that you believe need to happen for us to get that vaccination rollout back on track? Because clearly it is key. It is the light at the end of the tunnel to get back to some kind of normalcy.
Thanks, Rocco. You're absolutely right. Vaccines, along with rapid tests as well, are the ways we can round the corner and start securing that future, rebuilding, reopening, returning life to normal. As you know, Canada was 6 months behind in the regulatory and the procurement of rapid tests. We didn't have them nationally rolled out before the second wave, so we haven't integrated that tool as smartly as we could. But vaccines is where we're really behind. We don't have a domestic capacity, and dozens of countries, including many without even the bioscience and pharmaceutical history of Canada, have developed that capacity or have licensed the capacity to manufacture. This is what frustrates me to no end, Rocco. The Trudeau government didn't learn a single lesson from when they were caught shorthanded in March and April on PPE, on critical elements. They had some great auto companies and CEAE and other great companies, many of your members, pivot to make ventilators. My old employer, Procter & Gamble in Belleville, made PPE. That was fantastic, but they didn't develop that domestic capacity for the manufacture of a vaccine. That was a huge miss. And did they think there was not going to be this global protectionism, global supply chain rush for vaccines as well? Chrystia Freeland in the spring, last March, April, called PPE procurement the Wild West. Did they actually think that Wild West would disappear for vaccines? So that was a huge miss. The partnership with China was a huge miss. The late to the contract development and regulatory approval was a huge miss. And we were calling for that all last spring. In fact, I called for self-sufficiency and all of these things in April and May. And I wish we were in a role. I wish we had a prime minister that is used to building teams and urgency from my military, my private sector, and my time in cabinet, but we didn't. What do we do now? We need a full disclosure of the contracts to see which are actually options to buy, which are best efforts for delivery in the first quarter. Other countries have firm penalized volumes by month. We don't. And the Prime Minister's reluctance to be transparent means that despite their portfolio language, we did not secure quick and steady supply. And we don't have a written commitment from the EU on the protectionism angle. So what we have to do is leverage relationships in the EU to lock in that supply without export controls. We have to talk to the Biden administration about perhaps accessing, as they get their rollout, accessing some supply, in the Pfizer example, from the Kalamazoo plant. What can we do to accelerate the retooling of this latest announcement for the NRC facility in Montreal? I don't have all the information, but I know that we would have been ahead of where we would, and we're willing to work with them now. I can't state it enough. I want them to succeed, and this secrecy and lack of transparency is making it hard for business to try and help, for the opposition to try and help. So the Prime Minister should release the contracts and start being honest with Canadians.
Thank you, Leader O'Toole. Look, my dad's always taught me that the best time to make friends is when you don't need them. There's been a lot of discussion around the role of pharma and how to build the kind of goodwill that you need to go beyond contracts when the material hits the fan, and local capacity. What do you see as the future, and how we look at setting up innovative pharmaceutical capacity and that relationship in Canada going forward?
Great question, Rocco. And I did some healthcare regulation in the private sector with Procter & Gamble, more on the regulated health products and the DIN and the natural health products regime. But I know that innovation pipeline is critical. We talked to those industries a lot during our negotiations on the CETA, the European trade deal. As you probably know, the Trudeau government was holding the industry hostage over the last few years on the Patented Medicines Pricing Review Board. Magically, Rocco, over Christmas, those changes disappeared. After years of dialogue between industry, Mr. Trudeau, when caught behind a rock and a hard place, quietly just eliminated that requirement. But it was too late. You know, this war on work and the private sector and the so-called 1% that Mr. Trudeau attacks regularly has led to a lack of partnerships, has led to your members feeling unheard. You know, I love the fact that you have a committee that your members who've tried to step up to help with supply issues.
Our Vaccination Support Council.
That's it. And so let's build partnerships. I'm trying to do that with the private sector, with unions, with nonprofits, with research universities. It should be an all hands on deck, not an Ottawa knows best. So I think we have to be an innovation hub. And let's use this year, as you know, in the Toronto area, 100 years ago, this year, we developed insulin. And now we didn't commercialize it, and there's a whole, you know, goodwill element to that. But we actually are a bioscience leader, both for branded and generics. How can we leverage that and make sure we're never again caught unready for a crisis? And we don't have a government that is trying to pick fights with job creators across the country as the Trudeau government has been.
That's obviously longer term. You raised, and rightly so, the role that in the nearer term, rapid tests can play. And obviously, to be fair to the federal government, they bought several million of these, sent them to the provinces. Not all provinces, you know, unfortunately, have been willing to put them to use in the same way. Nova Scotia seems to be doing a reasonable job. What would you be doing? What would you be recommending to the provinces, and what the federal government can do to assure more supply on the rapid testing front?
We need national leadership. There has not been national leadership from the beginning of this crisis, originally with the border, with, in fact, early public health advice. And we were calling 6 months ago and greater, Rocco, for a national rollout of rapid testing. The problem you're highlighting, that a few provinces have not been using them, that's for two reasons. The Atlantic bubble, of course, has maintained lower levels. But in terms of Quebec and some other misuse, by the time the Trudeau government approved them, remember, my first day as the opposition leader, I raised to the Prime Minister that our European trade deals, some of our trade deals allow regulatory recognition to approve products that are approved in other jurisdictions faster. This is a diagnostic test, for goodness sake, a very basic medical device. It is not a cancer drug. We could have taken approvals and been rolling out a national approach to rapid tests when European and other countries were doing that. Then the provinces would have been able to use them before the second wave hit. The trouble is, Mr. Trudeau being 6 months late, the massive supplies came when we were in the second wave, Rocco. If you actually look at some of the pilots that OPG, Bruce, and other large employers have used with rapid testing, it is a key tool that allows quick determination with respect to isolating a workforce, preventing spread, and a positive test. If you're worried about the margin of error, you then isolate that person for a PCR test to follow up. So this is a tool. This is how business would operate. And the fact that there should have been a national rollout at airports, at federal ports, with large employers like the RCMP. So the federal government could have actually helped provide the baseline pilot test for the provinces months before the second wave started. This is about leadership, Rocco, and there is no leadership with the Liberal government, I'm sad to say.
Well, our members and many of the business community are continuing to push on this, and we appreciate your support in that advocacy. We think that's critical towards both the federal and the provincial governments to get that rolled out. It's often said that, you know, when someone is falling from a plane, they don't question the cost of the parachute. As an airman yourself, I know that you appreciate that wisdom. That said, at the end of this, and there will be an end to it, we're going to be in a position of massive debt at all levels of government and at the business level as well. Really looking at recovery and growth and competition in a new world. What are the broad strokes of your plan for balancing growth and moving from an economy of subsidy to an economy of private sector-led growth?
Great question, Rocco. And at the outset, as a former Sea King aviator, we didn't have parachutes in a helicopter. And in fact, we flew over the ocean, so we wore immersion suits, because if we were going down, we were going in the ocean, Rocco. And I want to make that totally clear. So look, I often say, Canadians, the path I talked about today, you could tell the path I don't want us to go on. We need job creation and economic potential for all sectors of the economy and all regions of the economy. Right now, we have national unity issues that didn't exist 5 years ago. They've developed under an Ottawa knows best under Mr. Trudeau. So we need all sectors to be firing again. I spoke to the forestry sector in Kenora in Northern Ontario early this morning as part of my virtual tour. We are world leaders in environmental social governance with our resource sectors, energy, forestry, mining, and minerals. We're also world leaders on an ESG standpoint for manufacturing. The Kitimat aluminum smelter that was left behind by Mr. Trudeau and Minister Freeland in the NAFTA negotiations is one of the greenest in the world. Same with the Saguenay in Quebec. Our auto industry, we need to be proud of this. And so I want the resource side to be ESGI global leaders. The I I'm adding is Indigenous engagement, because you look at a project like Tech Frontier that would have added 60 billion to our GDP that the company pulled back because Mr. Trudeau's government is so against resource development. There were 14 benefit agreements with that project for Indigenous communities. Reconciliation, a major part of it, Rocco, can be economic potential and partnerships. So we need to be ESGI leaders. We have to have a federal private sector approach to training programs. We did this a little bit at the tail end of the Conservative government with the Canada Jobs Grant. We ran out of time. We need those training dollars to actually partner with your clients and your members better, so that we know what skills gaps there are and make sure that training opportunities allows people that are being left behind currently to be retrained and for operations to expand here. We need simplified taxes. Our tax burden and our regulatory burden, particularly on small and medium-sized enterprises, is crazy. At a time where the US will likely continue some of the flatter taxes that we're seeing, we can't see a continued exodus of capital investment to the United States. I also want to have a plan to save small business. Talking to Restaurants Canada and others, the CFIB suggests that 46% of their members are worried about their solvency in the next year. We may need to pivot bankruptcy and insolvency legislation to make sure that we preserve those jobs and those businesses, use federal programs better, and federal investments in infrastructure, as much as they can have a multiplier effect to help job creation, that has to be a focus. We need all cylinders in our economic engine firing, Rocco, and that's everything from taxes, the role of government, and partnering with the private sector, as opposed to the barge pole approach Mr. Trudeau has had with your members. They're employers. They're the philanthropic donors in many of the communities that they're in. How can we partner to make sure they reinvest, they increase their productivity, and they hire more Canadians? That will be my relentless focus as someone that worked in the private sector just prior to my election.
As you look at those cylinders firing, clearly as an Ontario MP, you're also aware of one of our crown jewels, which is the nuclear power industry, not just for power purposes, but also life-saving medical isotopes and massive projects, refurbishments at Darlington and at Bruce. One of the key things they're raising, and it's also raised by our friends at GM as they're reinvesting in Oshawa and now the EV, is all around skills and getting people with the right skills into these jobs of the future, very high, well-paying jobs. So I want to give you a chance to deepen a little bit on the skills side that you touched in that answer, with a specific view to this, to two of these crown jewels of the Ontario economy.
I'm glad you've asked this question, Rocco, because a lot of Canadians don't know the largest sort of infrastructure project in Ontario right now is in my riding, the Darlington refurbishment. And when I went to Ottawa 7 years ago, I created a nuclear caucus to broaden and connect the energy from Saskatchewan with the technology and the employers and the supply chains from Ontario to promote the industry. And in fact, when I went to South Korea for our free trade agreement, I promoted the Can-Do Users Group. There are 75,000 high-paid, highly technical jobs in that sector. We're a world leader. And you know what? It's emission-free electricity generation. We should be selling it around the world, and we should be very proud of the supply chains. I've got Cameco in Port Hope, not far from me as well, that exports around the world. The biggest challenge that was identified, as you probably know, Rocco, to the Darlington refurbishment, skilled labor. In fact, they built the Energy Center, the mock-up, to learn the lessons from the Pickering refurbishment, but to also allow employees to do the refurbishment in mock-up first. And I've spoken to the leadership teams, over the last 8 years on how important that project is. Their one identified risk that's out of their control: access to skilled labor. I've mentioned this to my provincial counterparts in the Ford government. We know where the gaps are. We should be working on a federal level in terms of training funds to partner to fill those gaps with employers. And the provinces should be learning from this data. We track every job in the country under a National Occupation Code, NOC codes. We should then be adapting our high school and college and university program to also help fill the gaps, and our immigration system to accelerate productivity through a smart, really quick moving approach to immigration and skills recognition where we can, particularly once we emerge from the COVID recession. So this piece is very important. You've mentioned auto as well. I'm really proud that the GM plant in Oshawa, I grew up with it as the big employer that I knew as a kid, to see a vehicle coming back. Kudos to Jerry Dias and Unifor. We've squabbled in the past, but I want to fight for his members as much as I know he does. St. Catharines is going to look at EVs, but what's GM building, right? Trucks and SUVs. So we also can't dream up in Ottawa what everyone should drive. We have to make efficiency a driving force. And as the demand for EV rise, we not only need to manufacturing, the rare earth minerals should be Canadian, Rocco, because they should not come from China.
Well, a lot of wisdom in that, and obviously the new EV announcement by GM at the Kami plant is very significant as well, and Ford's announcement of doubling up their capital expenditure. Look, you mentioned earlier in your comments about the national tensions, the divisions by picking what's a good industry, what's a not so good industry. And you've also mentioned the decision that came on Keystone XL, which probably shouldn't have been a surprise given that the Obama administration had been against it. And so it's really a return to the status quo ante of Trump on that. But would something like an Energy East be back on the table in an O'Toole administration, or has that ship sailed?
Well, thanks, Rocco. I'm going to reference what we talked about in the waiting room for a moment. Yesterday, my conservative colleagues, we had a debate on the Canada-US relationship and an ability to get it back on track. I actually had a call with with Prime Minister Trudeau in November at my request to talk about a strategic approach, an all Team Canada approach to the incoming US administration, energy security, softwood lumber agreement, and alignment with the US on critical commodity capacity in Canada and in Canada, US, in North America, steel, aluminum, auto, uranium, other sectors. We have to be totally aligned, and we need to get into line with their position on China. The Trudeau government is out of step. You see the Biden administration just yesterday saying they want all their close allies to not have Huawei in their 5G. We've been asking this for years, Rocco. We had a motion in the House last year that we need to align, and I mentioned that in my speech today. And if we come up with an energy security approach, pipelines, the electricity grid, and critical supply, this is the type of beyond the border initiative, Western hemispheric initiative that we were talking about just 8 years ago. We have to get back to that special integrated trade, security, diplomatic partnership with the United States. And the Prime Minister, literally, it was clear to me in November he had zero plan to advance things before the Biden administration came in. He's now talking energy security. So maybe my call a few months ago did have some impact. And having worked for a large American company in Canada that's been in Canada for 100 years, a large employer, having served alongside the Americans in the military, I know that in Washington, trade and security are like this. And if you're out of step with them, you're not going to get the special deal that Canada has had. On the pipeline piece, we have to make sure that we eliminate the draconian measures from the Trudeau government on Bill C-69. The Darlington refurbishment, a hydro project, would not be approved under the confines of Bill C-69 because capital needs some type of certainty for major outlay of investment. Your members know this, Rocco. The members of the Trudeau cabinet do not. If you virtue signal with legislation, you're going to hurt working families. $160 billion of capital, much of it in energy in Western Canada, has left because of an unwelcome regulatory environment. We will not afford the high quality prosperity way of life we knew before COVID if we allow this approach to continue. So partnering with the provinces, reducing emissions, a net zero approach where we're mitigating, we're sequestering, and we're producing as ESGI leaders, that needs to be our focus. And then the private sector will determine which projects are the priority.
I'm excited by your ESGI and the I in particular, that inclusion of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, but also, as you well know, and as we've reported in our most recent research and policy results, this recession has really hit women and underrepresented groups far more severely than the mainstream. And so that notion of inclusion, be it people of color, Black women, and the Indigenous community, needs to be critically thought through. What does that look like, and what are the plans from an O'Toole administration?
Thank you, Rocco. A very important question. I've been talking about income inequality for many months. I've been leader for 5 months, and I've been talking about this steadily. We've seen COVID hit hard small businesses, particularly in retail and service. That has adversely impacted women, the she session that some people term it as well as some vulnerable groups, some disenfranchised groups have been adversely hurt too. So how can we have measures that address all of that? We are committed to that. And in particularly, the Save Small Business program I spoke about a little bit earlier has to be a willingness to revisit all elements of our economic recovery. How can BDC work better for loan assistance to companies? It is running too much like a private sector player without that crown role. How can we look at bankruptcy and insolvency, the CCAA. I worked on the restructuring of Air Canada as a lawyer, Rocco, in Toronto years ago. That restructuring process is about keeping the business as a going concern, because you save the jobs, you save the pensions, you save the supply chains. And then when the economy overall recovers, you've got economic activity and growth. So if everybody can adjust, including the government, on a tax and on some of our regulatory approaches, you preserve that opportunity for that business, those families, to thrive afterwards. We have to do that for small businesses, and then have some targeted programs for particular groups that are impacted. I like some of the outreach being done by great corporate leaders like my friend Wes Hall in Toronto. The outreach, the North Black Initiative, I believe it's called it.
Black North Initiative.
Black North, yeah. Fantastic. I've talked to many people how we can leverage that alongside some of the grants that Ottawa has announced, but has already clumsily disqualified people from qualification. We should allow Ottawa dollars to partner with a chamber or an organization like Wes's to identify need. An office tower in Gatineau is not going to know the need in Scarborough or in Mississauga. So I'm about partnerships, Rocco. And then on the Indigenous side, when I was a lawyer in Toronto before my election, I was partnering with the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. I got my firm at the time to partner with some great Indigenous leaders, Clint Davis, JP Gladue, and their members, to try and build partnerships within infrastructure, within resources. You know, here's an example. Suncor spends about $800 million per year through Indigenous run supply chain businesses. So some of the anti-resource policies of Ottawa, who do they hurt worst? Indigenous communities, often in remote areas where there's not opportunities. So I'm about partnerships. I hope that's apparent to all your members, with organizations like yours, with the private sector, with unions. We want people working. We want to secure our future. And Ottawa should not say, everybody out of the way, we know what's best. It's how can we work together to secure that future together.
It's interesting, as you know, Suncor, that number is large. It's even larger when you consider it's 10 times more than what the federal government spends with Indigenous businesses through purchasing. So the private sector has really been stepping up and walking the talk. Along with inclusion, which it's not often related to a conservative politician's policy priorities, is obviously the issue of climate change, something that that sometimes has proven difficult in that discussion, and yet clearly is having a major impact on weather, and therefore on insurance, and on all kinds of other consequences to our economy, to our individuals, and to the planet. Where does an O'Toole conservative government sit on that, and what specifically would you be looking to do to have an impact on this crucial issue?
This is an important issue, Rocco, for me, not just as someone that wants to be prime minister, as an MP from Southern Ontario, as a father. And it's important to me because I've worked on environmental issues since I left the military. In fact, volunteering on conservation projects. I actually ran an environmental business luncheon series at the Albany Club as a lawyer years ago, talking with wind developments. I was involved as a lawyer in the renewable fuel standard in Ontario. I worked on some of these issues, wrote about them, and I think they're important. And I'll be honest with you, I'm in the continuous improvement role as a leader of an organization. Conservatives, we did not have clear and solid enough commitments on the environment in previous elections. That will not happen under my watch. And so we're in the process of developing that right now, Rocco. In fact, I've said that I support a Made in Canada net zero by 2050 commitment that recognizes what industry is doing now, from an ESG perspective and accelerating that? How can government assist? How can we partner with provinces as opposed to a top-down federally imposed carbon tax when there's no carbon tax in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Ohio, the markets we compete with, right? And how can we also then accelerate the good work in terms of sequestration and storage, both from a technology basis? Saskatchewan's the world leader in that now. Elon Musk wants to invest $100 billion on CCS. It is going to be an important part of the climate future. And the carbon sinks both in the forestry sector and in agriculture are key too. So I think this will help Canadians understand there are good things we're doing now. There are things we need to do better and we need to mitigate. And how can government do that? I use this as an example. The Trudeau carbon tax approach decides to tax 30 million people and businesses, all of whom your parents are not the problem with climate change, Rocco. We actually know there's 600 emitters or so in Canada that account for 1/3 of our emissions. We also know that transportation is, as a segment, the most carbon intense. We should have tailored solutions to get that down without disrupting our economic progress. And I think we can do that within a made in Canada net zero approach with a smart government that is incentivizing, not penalizing. We're committed to that. The environment will be an important element of our campaign. I understand it and have worked in it far more than the Prime Minister or most of his cabinet. And I think people will see these issues are important for the Conservatives as we secure that economic future that will be our driving goal.
Thank you. One of the things that the great revealer of COVID has revealed is the digital divide in this country, and those areas and companies with access to broadband have done far better than those without. And that's not just economically, it's from learning at home, skills, reskilling, and also virtual healthcare. And we've certainly seen announcements at the federal, at the provincial level, and even the telecom providers, Bell, adding wonderfully another $1 billion to accelerate its infrastructure rollout to get more. But what is your priority, and what are your ideas with respect to ensuring that it becomes as common as any other utility, because quite clearly it's become critical to the economy and life in the 21st century?
You're bang on, Rocco. In fact, this morning, one of my business roundtables in Northern Ontario, the largest employer in Red Lake, said their biggest issue, particularly in COVID, is that reliable broadband, high-speed connectivity. And we can't have a digital divide because small businesses need access to that, both to access markets and to download CAD/CAM designs and other things. So that is a new utility, and government should approach it like this. We are not an ISP, the federal government, but how can we partner with our funds to make up the gap where there's not a business case based on population density? So I want to applaud Bell and Rogers and Shaw and Quebecor, all the players who are investing in this heavily. We're a huge country with a pretty sparse population. A lot of it is along the border in the south, but we have to serve Indigenous communities, northern communities. So this will be a major initiative. In fact, we're preparing a pretty ambitious approach to this issue and to rural economic development right now, because we are seeing a bit of a divide. And I've said we can't just have an economic recovery from COVID in the 416. It has to be all sectors, all parts of the country, and this broadband piece will be a key part of it. And when I've talked to industry, this is another thing, the ESGI I was talking about, I say to them, in some rural and remote communities, particularly where there's an Indigenous population, there's a lot of supply chains where the big players will actually outsource some of the actual localized installation. Can we partner with some Indigenous-led businesses there and maybe help with back-end bill payments and cycling? Because, in some cases, towns or distribution hydro companies could run internet services with their billing services. Perhaps there can be partnerships with Indigenous and remote communities on this as well to take some of the costs on the back end out once the capital is outlaid. So again, this is where Ottawa has a good intention, but doesn't know how to execute. We will execute much better through partnerships.
And I appreciate again the reference to Indigenous involvement. And we at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce are blessed to have Tabitha Bull, the current CEO of the Canadian Council on Aboriginal Businesses, on our board. And she asks that, you know, when it comes to infrastructure projects, and particularly thinking about the UNDRIP resolutions and thinking about how we ensure a process that is both respectful and involves appropriately the Indigenous community and the land rights that they have, and getting things done. How do you see yourself driving to that balance of mutual respect?
It's very important for me personally, and you have to get the balance right in talking about all of this. And I'm also even learning as a leader myself to make sure I always get that balance right, because this is a commitment I've had since I was at law school at Dalhousie and learned about the residential school system, for example. I didn't learn about that in school as my children, Molly and Jack, are now. And how can we make sure we commit to that? So I look forward to partnering with Tabitha and the leadership at the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business now. And I really think a key part of it has to be partnerships, infrastructure, and opportunity. And I think with UNDRIP, the goals behind UNDRIP, we fully support. In fact, long before the UN turned its attention to this, where was the biggest Indigenous reconciliation initiative? The Supreme Court of Canada and the Delgamuukw decision, based on our Constitution and based on hereditary rights. The fishing dispute in Atlantic Canada was one of the first substantive issues I brought up to the Prime Minister, and they were asleep at the switch on that issue. We have to find solutions that are smart. And in fact, and it means working with small businesses like some of the fishers there and Clearwater. We saw the Mi'kmaq Clearwater deal. That's pretty amazing how thinking outside the box can allow rights to be respected and to come up with a collaborative approach. Our only concern with UNDRIP, and I'll tell you, is this debate over the veto or not, because a veto approach will hurt Indigenous Canadians more than any other Canadian. You know, most of my constituents, other than my Indigenous constituents, particularly at the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, a reserve in my riding, wouldn't know that a veto to stop a development in Northern Ontario or in BC will hurt Indigenous Canadians more than it will preserve rights. So how can we get the balance right to have meaningful, substantive consultation, partnership, and economic benefit? We've already talked as Conservatives about having the best practices approach to resource revenue sharing agreements, employment and benefit agreements as part of resource projects. I think that is key to this, not a veto. So if we could have certainty on that, UNDRIP, 98% of it is aspirational, positive things that Canada's already doing and needs to do better in some places.
I appreciate the fact that you said, you're learning things as a leader, getting better, as we all hope to do each and every day. Kind of 6 months in, what have been kind of your key learnings, and what are the areas you want to work on to be a better leader and perhaps one day a prime minister?
Well, my father, who Rocco, had a great expression that you're born with one mouth and two ears, so you should listen twice as much as you speak. Now, as a politician, as a former lawyer, and as an Irish Canadian, I find that very hard to do. And I'm sure it's the same with you, Rocco. I've known you long enough. I'm sure you struggle with that too. But COVID has actually led me to need to reach out and ask people more, because I can't travel. I'm in my office here, and I'm listening to what's on the mind of your members, what's on the mind of you. I can almost guarantee there's not a single Canadian that has done more Zoom calls than Erin O'Toole, because I had to do this in my leadership. I'm in thousands now, maybe approaching 2,000. Some of the smallest have been 6. Some of the largest have been, thousands. I've learned from every engagement, and that's what a leader must do. And I think the absence of that with Mr. Trudeau, he has a small group around him that are very disconnected with the challenges in Atlantic Canada or in Alberta. They tend to do things for political wedge value as opposed to the national interest. And the Prime Minister doesn't have much experience prior to politics. And I think right now, we need to roll up the sleeves, get things done, Prime Minister, who's going to partner with your members, partner with Indigenous leaders, partner with nonprofit groups, not suggest that Ottawa has all the answers, but that Ottawa wants to help them get to the same goal we have, which is securing the future for every Canadian, addressing some of the inequalities by working with the people that know about it, as per my comments about Wes and some of those great initiatives. And we need a Prime Minister who brings that approach. And I'll tell you, my military experience, Rocco, we joked about helicopters and stuff. I've lived and trained in every part of this country. What a gift I had from my time in uniform. I haven't walked a mile in the shoes of someone from Newfoundland, Labrador, but I've stood on Hibernia. I've done fishery patrols off the Grand Banks and the Flemish Cap. I'm going to bring that fact that where I don't know the answer, I'm going to reach out and build a partnership to get to the answer that Canada needs. So perhaps in this crisis, when we have to secure our future, we need a new type of leader, and that's what I'm offering to Canadians.
Well, we really appreciate your time today. We appreciate your service in the military and politically, and your service as a father, because families are crucial to the future of our country as well. And you're always welcome to come back and engage with us. And with that, I'm going to, but just before I hand it over to Ariel, I do want to point out, I know that being the MP from Durham, that Darlington is near and dear to your heart. I do want to point out that there's this other massive nuclear infrastructure project in Bruce that's pretty large too, that we want to keep in mind, and couldn't get out of an OCC meeting without correcting that.
Let me say one thing too, Rocco. Both OPG and Bruce are great employers of veterans, and
yes.
In fact, they partner, they hire, and Ben Lobb, our MP who represents the Bruce, we're big fans. So thank you for making sure. I don't show favorites. I want to help everyone.
Yeah, and that helmets to the hard hats to helmets is a really great initiative. Ariel, over to you to wrap us up.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Leader O'Toole. My name is Ariel Benjamin, and I'm part of the Public Affairs team at the Ontario Chamber. Today, we're joined virtually by Chambers of Commerce, Boards of Trade, and businesses of all sizes from across the country. Our recently released Ontario Economic Report shows the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on small business and entrepreneurs, as well as specific regions, sectors, and demographics, highlighting the major vulnerabilities, but also the opportunities that Ontario will face in the year ahead. No business, region, sector, or demographic should be left behind in the pursuit of economic recovery and growth. That's why we've been calling for supports and recovery to focus on those hardest hit by the pandemic. As the indispensable partner of business, we appreciate your engagement during such a critical time with businesses in every corner of the province. I would like to also invite everyone to join us at our upcoming event on US-Canada relations on February 11th, where we'll discuss with expert panelists from both sides of the border what the new President Joe Biden's administration means for infrastructure, trade, labor, and environmental policy with our most important trading partner. We hope to see you there. Thank you again, Leader O'Toole, and for all of you for joining us, and I wish you a restful weekend.
Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, Rocco.
Pleasure, sir.